Chapter 1681. Sandy warned her in a deep voice, "Faye, don't you dare take another step away from the table." Freya's footsteps stopped for a split second, but she still left with Daisy in the end. Sandy stared at their figures as they left the restaurant, and her expression looked extremely piqued. It seems that getting to know the daughter of the Goldmans has made her more arrogant and contemptuous. I wanted to use this meal to win Daisy Vanderbilt over with Freya's help. However, not only did Freya not do anything to help, but she actually made it even worse than before. Ken wiped the corners of his lips with a handkerchief. "Mother, you don't have to worry that much. You should have seen it for yourself. That little princess trusts Faye very much, doesn't she? So what? It's not that you don't know Faye's personality. If Sandy had known that the daughter she gave birth to would grow up to behave like this, she would rather that she had not given birth to her in the first place." Ken lifted his eyelids. "No matter what she does, she still can't get rid of her identity. I'll make her listen to you eventually." Sandy sounded worried. That young girl from the Goldmans isn't someone to be trifled with, especially with Nole protecting her like that. Isn't it a piece of cake for us to break them up? What's more, that fella can't even rest easy now. Ever since Mr. Reese died, everyone has turned their attention to Donald and thinks it has something to do with him. Wouldn't it be interesting to let Donald know that Nole had approached Lara? Sandy was startled. "Do you have a solution to this matter?" Ken smirked. "The way to get the young girl to fall in love with someone else is to take advantage of any weak points in her relationship, and I've already chosen someone to accomplish that for us." Meanwhile, outside the restaurant. "Freya, you've just left the dinner. Will your mother do anything to you?" Freya stopped, but did not look back. "I've gotten very used to being threatened. What's there to be afraid of? The most that I'll get would be getting forced into an arranged marriage." "An arranged marriage?" Daisy was shocked by the reply and walked around her. "They threatened you with a marriage arrangement?" Freya did not utter a single word, which meant she admitted it tacitly. Daisy grabbed her by her shoulders. "Who do they want you to get married to?" Freya lowered her gaze. "Whoever they think will be beneficial to them." Daisy gasped. "I've never seen such family members. Are they even her family?" "It's okay, I don't care, and you don't have to worry about me." Freya frowned. "You're the one who needs to worry and be wary. It's obvious that my mother doesn't want you to be with Nole. Your identity is a stepping stone to the Noles that will make them even more powerful. She doesn't like the Noles, so in order to win you over for the family, they have to cut off your relationship with Nole." Daisy pursed her lips and said nothing. Freya sighed. "And don't underestimate Ken. He always catches somebody off guard with his ways of doing things. Who knows when he will take a shot at you?" Daisy released her hand and nodded. "I know. I'll be extra careful." At the underground black market, Nole sat at a gambling table and played a round of poker. Two groups of men were standing next to the table. One group consisted of Donald's men, and the other was the bodyguards that Nole had brought along. Nole played his cards. It was 3 aces of spades. Donald was smoking a cigar. He wafted the smoke aside and squinted. "You're so lucky, Mr. Knowles. It'd be a pity if you were to overdo things and run out of it." Listening to his pregnant words, Knowles gave off a smirk. "I didn't overdo anything. Why the sudden advice, Mr. Matthews?" He dusted off the ash. "Mr. Reese is dead, and the public is pointing all their fingers at me. But it turns out that you had met Lara before that, and that girl named Lisa, you're the one who asked Lara to bring her along when she came to see me." "Yes." Knowles admitted it. "But Mr. Reese's death has nothing to do with me. I went to meet Miss Reese only to offer her a way out. As for Lisa, I admit that I wanted to torture her through you. On the contrary, if Lisa didn't go along with Lara that night, you would have made a move on Miss Reese, and you'd be in an even worse situation now. Good luck trying to explain Mr. Reese's death now." Chapter 1682. Donald leaned the cigar against the rim of the ashtray and reached out to draw a card. Then did you expect Mr. Reese to die? No, Mr. Reese's death is beyond my expectations. Nole responded calmly. On the contrary, some people hope that Mr. Reese's death will cause a conflict of interest between you and me. Donald's movement froze for a split second, and he lifted his gaze, glanced at Nole, but did not speak. Nole looked at him calmly. The person who killed Mr. Reese wanted to start a war. The public is now on your back, but you didn't lay a single finger on Miss Reese the other night, did you? If Donald had not touched Lara, then Jonah and Donald would have nothing to argue about. Thus, if there was no argument, Donald would not have the motive to end Mr. Reese's life. The public speculation was that Lara had once rejected Donald, and that made him vengeful, so he chose to settle the score with such a move. Therefore, as long as Lara was not held captive by Donald, the rumors would collapse on themselves eventually. The matter that Nole had overlooked gave Donald a chance to clear his name. Donald thought about his words, and after a few minutes, he laughed loudly. It seems that you have the ability to resolve this matter. I'll trust you for the time being. He placed the poker cards down and got up. It's thanks to you that I've benefited from Lisa. She's such a great pawn, so why not make good use of her? He then left with his men. Edison walked up to Nole's side, leaned over, and said something to him. Nole narrowed his eyes and did not say anything. After getting back into the car, Nole loosened his tie. Who took Lara away? Edison replied, Mr. Ken Pruitt was there at Mr. Reese's funeral, and Miss Reese disappeared after that. I suspect that it's Mr. Pruitt who took her away. Nole's brows and eyes looked extremely gloomy and cold. It seems that Mr. Reese's death has something to do with Ken. Edison did not understand the matter. Ken has gotten so many benefits from Mr. Reese. If it wasn't for Mr. Reese, he wouldn't have been able to climb up to where he is today. Why would he kill Mr. Reese? Nole looked out the window. Perhaps it was to get Donald to come at me. As long as Donald and I start a war and get hurt in any aspect, he'll be able to take advantage of the situation. And as long as the Noles end up in a tough spot where we can no longer recover from, it'll do him good. By killing Mr. Reese, Ken will be able to direct his death in Donald's way and, with that, make Donald suspect that I'm the person who set him up. And once Donald starts to make a move on the Noles, we won't have the time and energy to stop Ken from searching for his next stepping stone. Ken and his mother have been warier of the Noles than they've ever been recently. It seems that they're eyeing the Goldmans who are sitting behind Daisy. My relationship with Daisy is the last thing they want to see in this world. Otherwise, Ken wouldn't have hired Ian to approach Daisy. He retracted his gaze. Send someone to keep an eye on every move that he makes secretly, and by the way, bring Ian's matter up to Coleman. Ken thinks that this will stop me, but it's a pity that he's underestimated the second son of the Goldmans, Coleman Goldman. In the suburbs, at a private villa. A car was parked in the courtyard. Ken got out of the car, stepped into the living room, and the maid reported to him each and everything that Lara had done that day. He unbuttoned his sleeves and followed the maid to the backyard. Lara was sitting on the ground. The beautiful dress that had been washed and was hanging on the clothes rack was now lying on the ground, torn into pieces, and scraps of cloth were scattered all around the ground. She looked as if she was in a trance, but normal at the same time. Her hair, which had not been washed for days, was dry and messy, and the wounded half of her face looked hideous, which made her look scary. The maid stepped forward and reminded her of something, but she did not respond. Ken asked the maid to step back. He stopped by Lara's side, half squatted, and picked up the rags on the ground. These are all your favorite clothes. Chapter 1683. The clothes were all high-end, limited edition, designer-branded clothes. Before her family ran into a dead end and she dropped from where she was, Lara never liked others touching her clothes. Even when she was attending events, if an artist were to step on the hem of her dress by accident, she would rain fire and brimstone on that individual. Lara did not respond to him but became even merrier instead as she tore the clothes. Ken got up and motioned to the servant. "Bring her to wash up." The maid stepped forward to help her up, and Lara reacted violently, struggling and resisting her. "Don't touch me. Go away." There was nothing that the maid could do. Ken rolled up his sleeves, walked up to her, grabbed her by the hair, dragged her to the edge of the swimming pool, and submerged her head into the water. She choked and struggled in the pool, but the people on the side did not dare to stop him. Seeing that she gave up struggling, Ken pulled her head up, and she coughed violently, gasping for breath as light reflected off her wet and pale face. Ken swept her wet hair behind her, held her chin in his hand, and lowered his voice. "Since you've chosen to pretend that you've lost your mind, then you should put up the show for the rest of your life and don't let anyone find out." Lara's shoulders trembled as her eyes dimmed. "Don't worry." Ken lifted her face. "The Reeses are the ones who allowed me to climb to where I am today, and I consider that a favor. If you were to die too, wouldn't that make me an ungrateful person?" He giggled and stroked the burnt half of her face with his palm. He did not seem to feel disgusted by it. She dodged his hand subconsciously and was held down by him. "The Reeses lost power, and my fiancée was disfigured, but I didn't abandon her and took good care of her. So listen, this is such a beautiful story which will be sung and praised." Knowing that he was acting in front of people but was actually imprisoning her, Lara could tell he was only using her to showcase his sympathy, deep affection for her, and righteousness to make everyone stand on his side. Thus, even if he were to take over all of Jonah's assets, no one would doubt his intentions. Lara glared at him fiercely. "The public will surely expose your hypocrisy someday." A hint of indifferent hilarity flashed across Ken's eyes. "It doesn't matter. After all, who will believe what a lunatic says?" Lara froze all of a sudden. Even her last ounce of strength was drawn out of her body. The maid stepped forward and took her into the house, but she did not resist this time around. With the college's anniversary celebrations approaching, the students of the Department of Drama, Theater, and Film had become very busy. After Daisy rehearsed for the catwalk performance and walked out of the performance hall, she saw Ian standing at the entrance. She walked over. "Ian?" Ian turned to look at her and smiled. "Is the rehearsal over?" She hung the backpack on her shoulders. "Yeah, you haven't left yet?" "Yeah." He nodded and glanced at her as if he had something to ask of her. "I have a favor to ask." She asked, "What's that?" "Our lecturer asked me to find myself a partner, but my original partner can't perform on that day because she got caught up in something else, so." Ian shrugged. "I want to ask if you could help me with this matter." Before Daisy could answer, he added, "It's okay if it's inconvenient from your side." "I'm just asking." Daisy lowered her gaze and pondered for some time. "Can you give me some time to ask my boyfriend about this?" Ian paused for a split second. "Will he disagree with this?" Daisy explained with a grin, "It's not that he disagrees. It's just that I'm his girlfriend, so I have to communicate this with him in advance, right?" Although Nole did not limit her in her friend-making journey, she did not want him to misunderstand. "Is that so?" An imperceptible change flashed across Ian's face, but soon, he put on a polite smile. "Well, if it's a no-go from his end, it's not a must for you to help me too." After Daisy left, Ian stared at her figure and fell into contemplation. Later on, in the dorm, chapter 1684. Daisy lay on the bed and sent a message to Nole. She waited for a long time, but he did not reply, so she turned over, lay on her back, and stared at the ceiling. Freya came back from buying some snacks and saw that Daisy's room door was ajar, so she walked over and stood by the door. "Yo, you're here." Daisy sat up and saw her lifting the bags in her hand. "I bought Korean pancakes. Do you want some?" The two sat on the couch and ate the pancakes together. Daisy suddenly thought of something, turned to her, and asked, "Has Nole been very busy recently?" Freya smiled. "Can't you just ask him yourself?" He hasn't texted me back. Pfft. A woman that smells of sourness and jealousy. Freya tore a pancake apart without raising her head. You don't have lectures in the afternoon. If you want to see him, just go to the Nole's group to find him. Why must you always wait for him to come to you? Daisy was startled. Is it okay for me to do so? She sneered. You're the future Mrs. Knowles. Who would have the guts to stop you? Daisy pouted and muttered softly, we're nowhere near there yet. That's just a matter of time. Freya lifted her gaze and glanced at her. Nole will never let you marry another man, won't he? Given Nole's temperament, he would storm into her wedding ceremony and snatch her away if she were to get married to another man. She lowered her head, and her cheeks started to warm up again. In the afternoon, Daisy actually went to the Nole's group. She stood outside the company and hesitated for a bit before entering the lobby. She walked up to the front desk, and the receptionist smiled and asked, How may I help you, miss? I'm looking for Nole Knowles. Is he here? The receptionist was stunned. Are you here for Mr. Knowles? Daisy was too embarrassed to mention the word girlfriend, so she claimed, I'm his classmate, and I have something to discuss with him. The receptionist called the administration department for her to inquire. Someone answered the phone from the other end of the call, and the receptionist then looked at Daisy. I'm sorry, Mr. Knowles is still in the meeting, so he might be late. Perhaps you can take a seat and wait for him? Daisy nodded. She walked to the couch, sat down, picked up a magazine, and flipped through it. After the 2-hour meeting, Nole walked into the office, and Edison handed him the document. Mr. Knowles, Miss Reese seems to have been confined by Ken. Nole took the document from him. That's not surprising to me. Mr. Reese died, and the wealth he left behind belongs to Lara now. The relatives of the Reeses are eyeing her for this wealth. So, if he wants to get his hand on that inheritance righteously, he'll certainly have to work hard for it. After all, he's the prospective son-in-law of the Reeses. Now that the Reeses have fallen and Lara has been disfigured, Ken will have to show his profound love for Lara and respect for the family as a prospective son-in-law in order to keep the inheritance of the Reeses to himself. Edison frowned. Ken really will do anything just to achieve his goals. I also heard that he intends to marry his sister to Donald Matthews. Nole raised his head. If Donald were to learn that he's the one behind Mr. Reese's death, would he still accept the marriage proposal? What do you mean? Nole calmly closed the document. He's able to arouse Donald's suspicion of me, so why can't I direct the suspicion back to him? Edison was a little worried. But we don't have any evidence that shows that he's the one who killed Mr. Reese. Then we'll make something up. There was a knock on the door of the office, and Nole glanced at the door. Come in. His secretary pushed open the door and walked in. Mr. Knowles, there's a lady in the lobby who's been waiting for you for a long time. She claimed that she's your classmate. Nole paused for a short moment. What's her name? Chapter 1685. The secretary scratched her cheeks. She didn't give us a name, but she's been here for a long time. Nole got up suddenly and hurried out of the office, followed by the secretary and Edison. At the lobby. Daisy was sleepy after waiting so long and could not wait any longer, so she got up and left without hesitation. She walked out of the building and reached her arm out to hail a cab. But she was stopped by a figure that appeared behind her, approached, and pulled her back. She was caught off guard and slammed into his arms. Daisy was stunned and raised her head. And judging from Nole's heaving chest, it seemed that he had rushed out of the building in order to catch up to her. He then took a few deep breaths and calmed him, breathing down. Why didn't you call me? You didn't reply when I texted you, and weren't you in a meeting? Daisy lowered her gaze. I was afraid that you were busy, and I'd disturb. Before she could finish speaking, Nole had already pulled her into his arms. And the triceps on the back of his arms bulged slightly, so one could only imagine how much strength he was exerting. Daisy buried herself in his arms and nudged him. I'm about to run out of breath. He loosened his embrace a little, but kept holding her and didn't let go. Dummy, when you saw that I didn't reply to you, didn't you know how to give May a call? How do you know if I'm busy if you don't call me? She looked up at him. You were in a meeting. If that doesn't spell busy, what does? I'm busy. He stroked her cheek with his palm. But I'll answer all your calls no matter how busy I am. Daisy blushed. The passers-by walked by them and peeped at them. Daisy felt a little embarrassed, so she broke free from his arms. I'm heading back already. Since you're already here. Nole grabbed her wrist and leaned closer to her ear. Accompany me to the end of the day and get off work with me. She looked away, feeling pissed. You've made me wait for so long. I'm not going to accompany you tonight. He narrowed his eyes. Then I'll carry you back into the building. As he stretched out his hands and wrapped them around her waist, she avoided it with a smile. However, Nole pulled her back into his arms. How dare you escape me? She panicked, afraid of being seen, and lowered her voice. I'll go with you, but you're not allowed to carry me. Nole let go of her. He no longer carried her, but holding hands was still a must. When Nole and Daisy walked into the lobby, all the employees were astounded. It's rumored that young Master Knowles has a girlfriend. It's indeed true. Compared to Edison, the secretary's expression looked even more dumbfounded, as if she had just seen one of the world's wonders. Nole took a glance at Edison as if he was hinting at something. Edison understood it, nodded, and waited until he walked into the elevator with Daisy. The secretary wondered. What does Mr. Knowles want from us with that gaze? Edison did not answer. He walked up to the front desk and tapped on the marble countertop. Who from the administration department answered your call just now? The female employee replied cautiously, it was Bella. Notify the Human Resources Department that she's fired. After Edison left, the female receptionist's heart was racing. She was really glad that she was not the person who had offended Mr. Knowles' girlfriend. And when the secretary saw his response to the order given through a single gaze, she was completely far-fetched. This is as expected of Mr. Knowles' confidant. Who else would be able to receive that much information with just one look? It seems that I'll have to pay more attention in the future so that I won't end up on the other end of this situation too. The large office had plenty of light, and it had an excellent and strategic geographical position. One could see the Taiwan River from the window facing south, and to the north was a bustling street with a lot of traffic. Daisy stood in front of the window and looked down at the city. It was her first time getting such a clear view of the city. Nole hugged her from behind, rested his chin on the top of her head, and let off a chuckle. I'm glad that you've taken the initiative to come to see me. She choked and responded stubbornly, I didn't come to you because I wanted to see you. Chapter 1686. Really? Nole looked down and saw that her ears were red. I'm understanding this as you are not saying what you mean. Daisy turned around and placed her hand on his chest, her eyes looking elsewhere. Aren't you busy? Nole rested his forehead against hers. His warm breath blew in her face, it was warm and ticklish. She blinked, and her heart started thumping, then she quietly said, Go. Nole looked at her because her reaction was so simple. She couldn't resist a little teasing and would blush so easily. She was such an innocent lady. Daisy. His deep voice was so seductive. Daisy slowly looked up and was met with a kiss on her lips. She stopped breathing for a few seconds, and her hand on his chest curled up as she was pulled in. Nole's kisses made her sink deeper each time. His kisses would make her heart flutter, and she didn't want it to stop once she drowned in them. Seeing that she wasn't breathing properly, Nole let her go and ran his finger over her lips. Are you trying to snuff yourself? She buried her face in his chest and mumbled, You're bullying me. He laughed. If this is bullying, what is going to happen in the future? Daisy looked up, her clear eyes shining. What do you mean in the future? Nole looked at her. Do you really want to know? He leaned in close and whispered something into her ears. She felt her face flare up and immediately covered his mouth. Enough. He smiled. The girl was going to run away if he continued. He held the back of her hand and stopped teasing her. All right, I'm going to continue working. Nole walked behind the desk and sat down. He loved to tease her, but when he was working, he was fully focused on work. Daisy sat down on the couch and wanted to forget what she wanted to ask Nole. Meanwhile, Freya was taking the trash out at the dormitory, and someone stopped her when she was going back. She turned around, and it was Colton. Colton walked over with a stoic expression. Ian Harris works for your brother? She was surprised. What? He questioned, don't you know? Freya was suspicious of his attitude, but she smiled a moment later. Why do you think I know anything about Ken? Because we're siblings? Colton looked away and said, if he wanted to use you to suck up to Daisy, there wouldn't be a reason that he didn't tell you his plan. Freya crossed her arms. So, you think I'm sucking up to Daisy? Colton frowned. He was like Nole in a few ways, especially when it came to anything related to Daisy. Freya wouldn't expect him to trust her. Since you've already found out that Ian works with Ken, then you should remind your sister about it. Why are you speaking to me? Colton kept his cool. I just wanted to ask. You better not lie. He turned and left. Freya stood there looking down. Ian works with Ken. That's why he keeps showing up around Daisy. The sky grew dark, and the lights started lighting up. The Ferris wheel stood next to the riverbank, with bright lights lit up the area like a shining pearl. The tour ship docked on the bank while people walked around. Tourists from everywhere came for this magnificent view. Daisy headed straight toward the Ferris wheel and happily laughed. Nole, I want to go for a ride. Chapter 1687. Nole's eyes filled with love. Sure. He got Edison to get the tickets and then went into a cabin while holding Daisy's hand. The bright neon lights outside reflected on the glass. Daisy stood in front of the window with her hands pressed against the glass. Her heart beat quickly while the lights flickered below. Nole stared at her face, which was full of delight, and didn't want the beautiful moment to end. He was glad to just be able to see her like that. I heard that couples who take a Ferris wheel together end up breaking up, but if they kiss when they're at the highest point, they will stay together forever. Is it true? Daisy turned to look at him and stared straight into his deep eyes. Nole never believed the legend of the Ferris wheel, because even if it didn't exist, he would stay with her forever. But when he looked at her innocent face and eyes that were full of hope, he gulped. He put out his hand, held her by her wrist, and pulled her into his arms. Is this what you mean? The Ferris wheel was already at the highest point, so he leaned down and kissed her. And the kiss was deeper than usual. Daisy leaned in his arms and looked at his face, which was inches away. Her heartstrings were pulled and startled to ripple. Time seemed to have stopped at that moment. A few minutes later, they got out of the cabin. The lights around shone bright and hit her flushed cheeks. Daisy missed a step and stumbled, but Nole caught her and laughed. Are your knees weak? Her face was even hotter. Nonsense. Anyone would misunderstand if they heard that. Edison waited for them next to the car, opened the door, and let Daisy get in once they walked back. Nole asked him to send her back to the Hilton Villas. The car drove toward the destination while the lights outside shone in. Daisy looked at him through the corner of her eyes. He had his head resting on his fist while leaning against the window. His collar was unbuttoned, and he looked lazy. Suddenly, her phone rang, and she jumped. When she saw that Colton was calling, she immediately picked up, but Nole took her phone in the next second. She's with me. When he heard Nole's voice, Colton paused for 2 seconds. Knowles, don't you think you're going too far? He had asked him to keep an eye on Ian, but had taken his sister away. Nole turned to look at Daisy and smiled. We're on a date. I'm not going too far. You have 10 minutes to bring her back to the villa. Colton ended the call. Daisy took the phone and whispered, "Is Colton angry?" Nole ran his fingers over her hair. "Don't worry. He's not." She didn't believe him because the Colton she knew would be furious that she was on a date with Nole. The car parked outside the villa, and as expected, Colton was standing outside on the porch and glared at them while they walked in. Daisy walked forward and smiled. "I'm sorry, Colton. I'll come home earlier next time." Colton pushed her inward. "Don't worry, go inside." Daisy didn't know what to say. She stopped at the doorway and was worried that Colton would do something to Nole, so she quietly hid behind a pillar. The two men stood in the garden, but she couldn't hear what they were saying. She ground her teeth and walked toward the flower bed under the dim light. Chapter 1688. "You said Ken Pruitt has gotten his hands on my sister?" Nole stared at him. The Reeses have fallen, so he would only find another person to leech off. Yorick ignored him, but if he can get Daisy to join in and solidify his status with the help of the Goldman, it will be a different story. Yorick Hathaway had seen through his tactics, so Ken couldn't continue with his plan. He might not be able to convince Nolan either. If he wanted a better standing and to get rid of his name as the son of an illegitimate child of royalty, the only way was to use Freya to get to Daisy. Colton smirked. He won't be able to. The Goldman didn't only have Daisy. There was Waylon and him, and their father was still around, so he wouldn't be able to get his way. Nole laughed. "Don't underestimate him. He's not as good with straightforward attacks, but you're not as cunning when it comes to curveballs." He leaned closer to Colton. "He can't touch you brothers, so he can only find a way in through Daisy. What if he manages to get to her through his people?" Colton squinted. "Do you mean Ian?" Then he laughed. "Knowles, have you lost confidence in yourself?" "My confidence matters less than your corporation." Knowles continued. "If he finds out that you're against me being with Daisy, it will mean that things are working in his favor." Colton laughed. "You're trying to make this about you. I believe that you'll make the right choice." He patted Colton's shoulder, turned, and got into his car. After the car drove away, Colton stood on the spot and frowned. When he heard movement at the flower bed, he turned around and took a deep breath. "Daisy Vanderbilt, come here." Daisy froze, because she had been caught. She slowly stood up, smiled, and walked out. "How long have you been listening?" "Not long." She looked at her shoes. "Just a few minutes." Before he could speak, she looked up again and said in a serious tone, "Colton, I know that Ken is trying to use me, but don't worry, I will be careful." Colton crossed his arms. "You didn't even realize that Ian works with him. How could we not worry?" Daisy looked around, took a deep breath, and walked over to him. "But I do now." Colton poked her head and didn't know what to do. "Now you do, but what if you never found out? I won't get involved if you want to make new friends, but please keep your eyes open. You're different from everyone, so the people who approach you are mostly after your family's fortune." It was horrible, but it was the truth. Humans were unpredictable and ever-changing. Even though one was in a good place now, if they fell, the friends around them would eventually disappear. The Reeses were the best example. If Daisy was from a normal family, and if people approached her without wanting anything in return, they would be real friends. However, Daisy was the princess of the Goldman family, a family with an impressive background. If people were nice to her, it would be mostly because of her family, and how many of those who approached her were genuinely nice. Daisy was quiet because she couldn't say anything. She had wanted to wager if Ian was worth hanging out with. Unfortunately, she lost the wager. Colton sighed as he placed his hand on her shoulder. "Dad and Waylon aren't here, but I am. You don't need to face anything alone." Chapter 1689. Daisy nodded. "All right. Go rest." Daisy walked into the villa and took a look at Colton, who was outside, then looked down. She balled her hands into fists. The next day, Daisy sat in the seats and watched the students who were late practicing their catwalk. When Ian came over, he brought drinks for everyone who was practicing and was very friendly. They were all very nice to him too. He kept one bottle of drink, walked toward Daisy, sat down next to her, and handed the bottle to her. "I just bought this." Daisy took it. "Thanks." But she didn't drink it. She just placed it on her right and continued watching the training. Ian looked at her. "You seem to have been here pretty early." "I can rest early if I reach early." Daisy turned around and smiled. "Have you found a partner?" Ian shrugged. "Not yet." "I can introduce someone to you." Daisy smiled. "We have a few girls from my class that are good." Ian's expression froze, but he chuckled in the blink of an eye. "That's too much to ask." Daisy waved her hand. "Not at all. They have time, so it's up to you." "What if?" Ian's eyes were fixed on her face. "If I want to partner up with you?" Daisy looked down and looked sorry. "I'm sorry, my boyfriend isn't alright with that." "I thought your boyfriend wasn't here?" "He's not, but it'd be different if he heard it from someone else." Daisy looked calm. "I don't want my boyfriend to misunderstand." "You seem different today." Ian looked over. Daisy seemed to be more insistent in her rejection today. She would usually just sidestep and wouldn't say no. "Really?" Daisy chuckled. "Maybe I slept late last night and suddenly figured it out. I shouldn't let him down when he trusts me so much." She packed her bag and left. At that moment, Ian's phone rang. It was Ken. He turned to look at Daisy to make sure that she had walked away before he picked up. "I'm afraid I'll have to let you down. She seems to be avoiding me." Ken was silent for a few seconds. "I guess you blew your cover." Ian got up and walked to a corner. "Mr. Pruitt, you should get someone else for this mission. I won't be able to pull it off." "There's nothing that you can't pull off. It's fine if your cover is blown, but the Goldman will have to accept it as long as she becomes yours." Ian paused. "What do you mean?" Ken buttoned up his suit with one hand. "You've been with women. There's no need for me to teach you how to get them into bed." "Are you crazy?" "I'm not going to risk it." He didn't want to follow in the Reese's footsteps. "Why are you worried?" "If you get her, you'll have leverage, and they won't be able to touch you." Ian was quiet, and his hand tightened around the phone. Ken hung up. He tossed the phone onto the desk, and a redhead in a lace nightie hugged him from behind. "Mr. Pruitt, were you happy with my performance last night?" Ken looked up and glanced at the seductive woman behind him through the mirror. "It doesn't matter if I'm happy." He turned around and grabbed her chin. "You need to make Mr. Matthews happy." Chapter 1690. The redhead's expression changed. "You plan to give me to that devil Matthews?" "It's because you look so much like Laura Reese." Ken grabbed her face with no expression. "Matthews loves wild, seductive women like you." The woman sat on the floor while Ken walked around her. "I'll arrange for some surgery for you to make your face look as close to Laura as possible. After 3 months, I'm confident that he'll be interested in you." Ken returned to the villa and walked in. Laura sat at the dining table and didn't look interested in the breakfast that was laid in front of her. She just ate some cereal. The maid walked next to him and lowered her head. "Sir, Miss Reese cooperated this morning and didn't make a scene." Ken nodded. "Leave us." The maid left, and he walked over to Laura while running his hand along the table, then looked down at her. "You're finally behaving." Laura stirred her cereal around with cold eyes. Ken touched her bright blonde curly hair. "What do you think about a wedding?" She froze while his voice continued. "Haven't you always looked forward to our wedding? Now that the Reeses are no longer around, will our wedding still go on?" Laura's hand that was holding the spoon started shaking. Before the Reeses' downfall, Ken had always pretended to be the gentlemanly fiancé. He would behave and do whatever she wanted, so she didn't care about his background. Even if she couldn't see his love for her in his eyes. But when the Reeses lost their power, and he showed his stripes. She finally saw that she had been keeping a terrifying person next to her. Was this her punishment? Ken pulled out a chair, sat down, and held her gold hand with a smirk. No one would want to marry a disfigured crazy woman, do you understand? Lara grabbed his arm with blood-red eyes. Ken, I'll give you everything I have. Please let me go. Nobody will blame you for leaving me when you get what you want. I brought this on myself. Seeing a helper walking past upstairs, he pulled her into his arms. Nonsense, Lars. Why would I leave you? He kissed her forehead. I'll bring you to the mall tomorrow. I know you love clothes from CD, and they have a new collection. I'm sure you'll like them. Lara struggled and waved her arms around so much that she pushed the cutlery on the table to the floor. He didn't let go even though the milk spilled on his pants. From the helper's perspectives, Lara was going crazy again, and her fiancé was taking care of her. Within a week, Ken was in the news a few times, and they were all related to Lara. The media reported that he was a loyal person who didn't leave his fiancée even when she was disfigured. His reputation swelled because of that. Edison handed a magazine to Nole. Just as you predicted, Ken used Lara to rebuild his reputation. No one will believe that Jonah Reese's death had anything to do with him. Nole looked at the magazine cover but didn't speak. There was a knock on the door, and Edison went to open it. The secretary brought in a woman with red hair. The redhead walked forward quickly and begged with tears running down her face, "Young Master Knowles, please help me. Ken Pruitt is trying to give me to Mr. Matthews as a gift."